So a common critic you're going to hear about capitalism is the argument today with the monopolies, and you'll hear people fling around the word monopoly, such as the giant trust in the late 19th century with the myth of the robber barons. So it's the same thing with regards to the corporations in general. So even today when you talk about Microsoft or big tech, you'll hear the word flung around so loosely. If you think of the word mono means singular, and when talking about a monopoly, it basically means a trust or a business would 100% own the market. So in other words, there's no competition whatsoever, and they would be able to drive the prices up to shaft the consumer. They believe that the antitrust legislation was brought in to break all these supposed monopolies up, all in the name of protecting the consumer, but it didn't protect the consumer, it did the exact opposite.
Not long ago, I visited some farmers in Missouri whose profits are disappearing. Why? Monsanto alone owns the key genetic traits to more than 90% of the soybeans planted by farmers in the United States and 80% of the corn.
So the question is here, with 80 and 90%, is Monsanto owning 100% share of the market? Are they an actual monopoly? Or is it a case of just flinging that word around just to mean anybody that owns, 90 or 80 odd percent or whatever? And this is important because it was the same accusation that was used against John D. Rockefeller. A prime example of the damage the government caused through its antitrust law legislation and its regulation was the Great Northern Railroad built by James J. Hill. He built the only successful transcontinental railroad in American history, whereas the hundreds of other companies, they are all facing bankruptcy. Whether you're talking about that of the Northern Pacific, or of course another company would be the Union Pacific, etc., they all faced bankruptcy because of taking on government subsidies.
In the 1890s, all the transcontinentals except the Great Northern went bankrupt in the Panic of 1893. Hill, backed by J.P. Morgan, will get de facto control of the Northern Pacific. They will purchase a controlling interest in the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. All of these lines together, plus some smaller lines, will form the basis of what's about to become the Northern Securities Company.
When taking on the government subsidies, they would end up being faced with all the heavy government regulation, etc., the certain regulation that would cause them damage and make their business unprofitable. So it made it harder for them to even get by. James J. Hill, refusing to take on government subsidies, he was able to run business successfully. It proved that with the Great Northern Railroad. Now, even although James J. Hill is doing quite well for himself and all the others are going bankrupt, it doesn't mean to say it's going to lead to a monopoly. In a free market, you've got the freedom to step in. There's no barrier to entry into the market. And if an industry is profitable, just like that of, Standard Oil during the 1860s, the oil refinery market was very profitable. So what does that do? It entices competition to step in. So they want to jump in and get a piece of the pie. So that's the point. It's not going to lead to a monopoly. However, James J. Hill, despite the fact that he was so successful, he was treated unfairly. And an example of this was given by Thomas J. DiLorenzo in his book How Capitalism Saved America. He goes on to quote, "Despite the quality services and reduced cost that Hill brought to Americans, he would be unfairly lumped in with the political entrepreneurs who were fleecing the taxpayers and consumers. The public eventually began complaining of the monopoly pricing and corruption that were inherent features of the government-created and subsidised railroads. The federal government responded to the complaints with the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which was supposed to ban rail rate discrimination, and later with the Hepburn Act of 1906, which made it illegal to charge different rates to different consumers. What these two federal laws did was outlaw Hill's price cutting by forcing railroads to charge everyone the same high rates. This was all done in the name of consumer protection, giving it an Orwellian aura." So this is why I mentioned the difference between the market and political entrepreneurs. The ones who were carrying out the monopoly pricing were the political entrepreneurs, but the likes of Rockefeller, James J. Hill, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the ones who were accused of holding monopolies, they didn't hold monopolies. They were the ones benefiting the consumer the most. Government's regulation ended up going against the consumer and ended up charging higher prices, and this is what you saw throughout recorded history. The antitrust law legislation did the exact same thing to the tobacco company in the early 20th century, and it goes right up to this period where you see the likes of big tech. When people complain about this to do with so-called monopolies, they fling around that word without properly understanding what it actually means, and the likes of Google end up getting the accusation. They step in with all their good intentions with the government legislation, and it ends up shafting the very consumers that they are proclaiming to protect.
Which means Monsanto can charge farmers much higher prices.
The only reason why Monsanto is able to do that, and they're not a monopoly by the way, if they've got competition on their back, they might be an oligopoly, but the only reason why they're able to do that is because it's not a free market, folk.
When FDR came into office, he's got this tremendous agricultural bounty, and because of all this food, prices on food keep falling.
Wait, you're telling me it's a problem during a depression that food has become cheap?
I don't think it's a problem, but FDR did, because for the farmer, it's not good for prices to fall. So FDR's Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to cut back on production, or even to produce nothing at all. Less food means higher prices, so he paid farmers to destroy a huge amount of crops in order to raise prices to make farmers better off. So 6 million pigs were slaughtered. 10 million acres of cotton were destroyed.
This sounds like a good idea, not the way you're spinning it. Because the government comes, it slaughters pigs from my farm, I'm the farmer, I get paid for the pigs, and then that meat, that pork, goes to feed poor people.
No, the pork gets destroyed. The cotton gets destroyed. All this stuff got destroyed to pull it off the market and raise prices, not give it to poor people. Mules were actually employed to destroy cotton. They actually had mules stomp on the cotton. And at first they hesitated to do it because this is not what a mule normally does. They had to be forced to do it. The whole New Deal was about helping one group, and then another group, and then another group. Even though each time you help that one group, you're harming everybody else. And it turns out you didn't even help the farmers, because other New Deal programs were even more successful, driving up other prices.
A free market means that you've got free entry into the market, as I say. There's nothing stopping competition stepping into a free market, because there's no barrier to entry into the market. And if anything, see if a company like Monsanto existed in a free market, there's no government protectionism, and let's say Monsanto is making big profits, all that is going to do is it's going to entice others to step in and compete. The very reason why you've got this problem today, where they're able to charge higher prices, there's a corporatist system. There's no free market. Therefore, there is barriers to entry into the market. The heavy government regulation has basically restricted competition and has made an oligopolistic market where Monsanto is able to drive their prices up and nobody's able to compete.
And farmers are getting squeezed from the other side too, because the food processors they sell their products to are also consolidating into mega companies that have so much market power they can cut the prices they pay to farmers.
In the United Kingdom, it's the exact same story. You've got an oligopoly with the giant supermarkets, and they're exploiting the farmers, and what the giant supermarkets are saying, you better lower your prices to us and sell to us, or we'll go elsewhere and get it. But why is that oligopoly with the giant supermarkets formed? It formed because of the heavy government regulation. It's not because of a free market. In a free market, there's competition that will freely just jump in and offer goods at a cheaper price. And of course, what does that do? It forces other competitors to do the same. He's the same type of person who asks and demands for more government regulation. He's the cause of the problem.
America used to have antitrust laws that stopped corporations from monopolizing markets and often broke up the biggest culprits.
And there you have the accusation again there with that of the Standard Oil. John D. Rockefeller claiming that he held a monopoly when he never. He had a higher level of productive output. The very industries they accused of holding monopolies saw a higher level of productive output. The consumer price index had fallen. Those were the companies that were just more efficient than that of the rest of their competitors, etc. But there was still competition there. They always make up these myths, and they always read it from a load of nonsense like Ron Chernow, etc. Rockefeller never used predatory pricing, folk. Predatory pricing is based on the idea lower your prices and then all of a sudden it would wipe out competition and it would drive the prices up and shaft the consumer once there's no competition left. Why is that a problem? Well, the problem is why would you lower your prices below the costs of the operation of your business and run at a loss until, of course, you know, all of a sudden they all go out of business? Well, it doesn't work like that. An example I gave before, you know, Herbert Dow's chemical company, where the German cartel tried exactly that with the predatory pricing, and of course they were reducing their prices. Before you know it, they ended up surrendering, because all Herbert Dow was doing was buying up their cheaper prices by, sending secret agents to their company, buying it up and selling it off at the higher price. That's why predatory pricing is the most irrational idea. It's theoretical, that's never existed. Nowhere in recorded history has a monopoly ever stemmed from predatory pricing. Nowhere, not one example. The only way you can create a monopoly is through restricting productive output.
I'm in a supermarket. Looks like lots of choice, doesn't it? But let's take a closer look. The 4 largest food companies control 82% of beef packing, 85% of soybean processing, 63% of pork packing, and 53% of chicken processing. All these products and brands from just 10 huge corporations.
Yeah, that's not a monopoly, but as such, if there's competition, then of course that doesn't define what a monopoly is. Yes, there is a problem in today's market. It's not a free market. What he's explaining is in today's example, where you've got corporatism, government picking, choosing winners and losers, the strong government regulation, other problems to do with inflationary issues regards to, the prices of things, etc. All of that has an influence. So you cannot lay the same argument with that to do with a free market.
What brand of cat food shall I buy? There are basically just 2 companies. The problem with all this consolidation into a handful of giant firms is they don't have to compete, which means they can jack up your prices.
The free market isn't there. Government's regulation created the whole problem. Look at the example of James J. Hill, how the regulation created that very problem, but he was punished for being better. He was punished for charging cheaper prices to the consumers.
Drug companies, in effect, pay the makers of generic drugs to delay cheaper versions. Such pay-for-delay agreements are illegal in other advanced economies, but antitrust enforcement hasn't laid a finger on them in America. They cost you and me an estimated $3.5 billion a year.
Again, folk, I've already touched upon the American healthcare market, issue to do with the American Medical Association monopoly, the overregulation of the private sector. I even touched upon the third-party payer system, which was created by government. Cost is monopolised in the background in the hands of third parties, and what they were able to do, the pharmaceutical companies, was to collude together, drive the prices up and shaft the consumer because of government's third-party payer system, because government monopolised in the background. In other words, the absence of the free market.
You think your health insurance will cover this? Well, health insurers are consolidating too, which is one reason your health insurance premiums, co-payments, and deductibles are soaring.
So the very reason why you've got the health insurance costs, etc., is because they've introduced health insurance for absolutely everything, all the unnecessary stuff. You can check out my video on the direct primary care, which is more of the free market model. They reduced the health insurance, the remaining 20% for that of the more serious needs. They were able to dramatically reduce the costs. So in other words, it contradicts this entire narrative. It's a typical example. Government creates a problem, the free market gets the blame.
You think you have lots of options for booking discount airline tickets and hotels online? Actually, you have only 2. Expedia merged with Orbitz, so that's one company. And then there's Priceline.
I think it's important to address the fact that just because a company, or let's say a trust, buys over other companies that were inefficient, like the way that John D. Rockefeller did with Standard Oil, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's a monopoly. And if anything, those he employed, he actually paid higher wages. The others went into his business, and of course they learned from his trade, and he was able to charge cheaper prices for the consumers.
How about your cable and internet service? Basically, 4 companies. This is unfortunate, to say the least, and not just because industries and services with little competition charge you more. It's also troubling because such consolidation keeps down wages.
Is it really people he's speaking about the entry-level type workers, in other words low-skilled workers, or is he speaking about skilled labour? When it comes to skilled labour, you have to compete for skilled labour, therefore the wages drive up. And plus the fact it's actually inflation that's been wiping that out. Inflation's been a very, very big problem for why there's been wage stagnation. They've been running the printing press like mad for years, so what the hell does he expect? What he completely ignores is consumer consumption has actually went up, so people are wealthier today than what they were 30 odd years ago.
These massive corporations also have a lot of political clout. That's one reason they're consolidating. Power. Antitrust laws were supposed to stop what's been going on.
So there you have it. It's basically lobbying government, political entrepreneurship in other words. He's insinuating that's capitalism, and it's not. Capitalism is not the political entrepreneurship, folk. It's market entrepreneurship. It's supporting the free market. The main rationale behind the antitrust law legislation was nothing at all to do with breaking up monopolies. It had everything to do with the McKinley tariff. It was nothing at all to do with breaking up monopolies, and even those in Congress admitted it.
The first antitrust law came in 1890 when Senator John Sherman responded to public anger about the economic and political power of the huge railroad, steel, telegraph, and oil cartels.
Yes, there was those charging unfair prices, like I mentioned earlier on, that being those who were political entrepreneurs. They can certainly lay the blame at unfairly, but to blame that of market entrepreneurs is just wrong.
Then called trusts, that were essentially running America. A handful of corporate chieftains, known as robber barons.
All these people that they claimed held monopolies, they didn't. Their productive output was increasing. They were simply far more intelligent than most of their competitors, etc. They still had competition in their back, which is why they never had monopolies. I think Sun Oil Company was an example of competition against that of Rockefeller. So Rockefeller most certainly did not hold a monopoly, simply because he was able to cost cut and reduce his prices. The fall in consumer prices is a contradiction of the entire meaning of a monopoly. If they claim that predatory pricing was used, that means prices would go up. Where was the higher prices? Exactly, they can't even tell you that.
Presided over all this, collecting great riches at the expense of workers who toiled long hours, often in dangerous conditions, for little pay.
Rubbish, folk. The real wage earning growth rate was increasing by 1.6% per year. So you might ask the question then, okay then, so why then did you face the strikes? It's because of the frustration of the growth. You see, you've got to remember, you never seen the strikes before the Industrial Revolution. Where were the strikes then? Well, the answer's simple. It was because of the frustration of the growth. It was a slow growth rate, but it was still growth. So that's what they were frustrated by. They wanted to see more, and that's the very reason why they were striking. There's even a Marxist, Richard Wolff, who conceded to that between 1840 right up to 1970 wages continuously increased.
Corporations gouged consumers and corrupted politics. They had so much political power, they made it impossible to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. Then in 1901, progressive reformer Teddy Roosevelt became president. By this time, the American public was demanding action. In his first message to Congress in December 1901, only 2 months after assuming the presidency, Roosevelt warned, "There is a widespread conviction in the minds of the American people that the great corporations, known as the trusts, are in certain of their features and tendencies hurtful to the general welfare." Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after the Northern Securities Company, a giant railroad trust run by J.P. Morgan, the nation's most powerful businessman. The U.S. Supreme Court backed him up and ordered the company dismantled. In 1911, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust was broken up too.
Remember what I says about the tobacco company? And this was round about the early 20th century, around about that time period that we was speaking about that today with Teddy Roosevelt or whatever. The example that I will give you is from the tobacco company. The circuit court admitted, for example, that the record in this case does not indicate that there has been any increase in the price of tobacco products to the consumer, and that there was no evidence of unfair competition or improper practices with regards to competitors. The court noted, in fact, that the volume of output of tobacco products had enormously increased. As Armentano concluded, 3 of the 4 circuit court judges admitted that there was a solid evidence to indicate the American tobacco was efficient, had not raised prices, had expanded outputs and not depressed leaf prices, and not dragooned competitors. Nevertheless, the formation of the trust was ruled illegal. Folk, that's a prime example of a trust that was wrongly done over because of their antitrust legislation. How anybody like him could talk the crap that he does is just unreal. Again, here's another following quote that contradicts his utter nonsense. The antitrust case against Standard Oil also seems absurd because its share of the petroleum products market had actually dropped significantly over the years. From a high of 88% in 1890, Standard Oil's market share had fallen to 64% by 1911. The year in which the US Supreme Court reaffirmed the lower court finding that Standard Oil was guilty of monopolising the petroleum products industry. Folks, see when you own about 64% share of the market, never mind 90, you're not holding a monopoly. The fact that his market share was dropping down to 64% is a contradiction of the entire meaning of a monopoly. That means there's more competition stepping in, just like that of the tobacco company. Unbelievable how many people buy into that crap. So his video obviously goes on for a good bit. All I need to say, folk, is that ever since that period you saw more and more government regulation, the market became more and more oligopolistic. And that's essentially what you see in the political entrepreneurship from that period onwards. You're always going to hear these accusations against capitalism, but it's contradicted by everything today with a free market and why a free market would prevent such a thing. You can look up, Turnbull. She basically wrote a book about, Standard Oil, and she basically accused them of using predatory pricing and driving prices up to shaft the consumer. If you've got anything you would like to ask, and comment in the comment section below, anything you'd like to add in yourself, again, comment. And again, be sure to like the video, share the video, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.